Good morning. Folklore Explorer is in Daventry, and I noticed there were some signposts coming up, and it said the fair was coming to town. And what caught my eye was it said it was called a MOP fair. That's MOP. You know, those things we wash the floor with. I thought, right, there's got to be some history behind this. So, yeah, I did use the Google to find out. I literally asked, what is a MOP fair? So the MOP fair has its origins back in the 14th century, which is quite amazing in itself. And the MOP fair was a hiring fair. So you can imagine you had everybody's lined up and they're holding the tools of their trade. And it suggests that maybe maidservants who would be cleaning quite a bit would hold the mop. If you were a farm labourer, you would hold one of the tools of trade related to the farm. And the employers, your potential employers, would come round. You'd all be standing in the marketplace, by the way, and the potential employers would come round and they would negotiate and haggle with you over what your annual wage would be and any extras that you might get. And once you've come to an agreement, they would give you a small amount of money that held you, it's binding as part of the contract, and you would then place your tools of your trade somewhere and you would wear ribbons, and the ribbons indicated that you had been hired, which is quite interesting when you think about when we see people in some of the folkloric wearing ribbons. Now, why did these hiring fairs come about? Apparently, well, we know a lot of people got killed during the Black Death, don't we? And a lot of serfs, that's the people that do most of the work, they were killed. A lot of them died. So that meant there were less people to do the work. And the less people to do the work meant they could start negotiating for better wages. Well, unfortunately, one of the earls didn't like the sound of that. He actually complained to King Edward III and said that he was concerned that these serfs were going around asking for more money that they didn't deserve. So King Edward III came up with a law called the Statute of Labourers. And essentially, the Statute of Labourers said that the labourers were not allowed to charge more than they did before the Black Death. So they weren't allowed to profit from it. Now, the really archaic part of this is, if you don't know anything about serfs, is serfs were meant to be tied to their village. And if you left your village and you were caught outside the village trying to get work elsewhere, they could brand you on your forehead with a big F. So you imagine having the letter F burnt into your forehead because you left the village to look for work elsewhere. And it meant falsify, because you weren't meant to be, you were meant to stay working for your overlord within that serfdom. Nothing was being done in the benefits of the serfs. So you can imagine there. But it does say that during this period of where there were not so many serfs around, some employers ignored the law and they would pay more to get the right number of people to come, and especially when it's harvest time, you can imagine they need to have people there to do the work. And if there are limited numbers, and it also suggests that quite a large number of the serfs disappeared off to London, where they could again earn higher wages. But the interesting part was these MOP fairs, they would also have a fun fair type of thing there. So there would be entertainment, and the people who had just been hired would use the money they had been given to tie them to their new employer. They could go and spend it on whatever was at the fair, which you can see, so there's money is involved in here. But it's also quite a nice idea. And when we think about places that have these traditional fairs that would have had their grounding in the hiring of new people, and Daventry is one of them, and apparently there is one in Stratford-upon-Avon. They have a hiring fair as well, or the fair has its origins in the hiring. Now, I found this quite interesting, and I also found it incredibly interesting about the fact that basically serfs were slaves and they weren't allowed to leave their village. You were not allowed to work outside of your village. But if you had a trade and you were a skilled person like a blacksmith or a carpenter, and you got lucky, you might have a sponsor who would take you on and maybe pay the fines that you might incur for moving on. Now, one of the things, another interesting part about the MOP fair is they would have a week later a second fair called the Runaway MOP. And this allowed either party to reconsider their agreement after a 1-week trial period and dissolve the contract if they were unhappy. But I haven't actually found any other information around this Runaway MOP fair. So I wonder, they don't tend to do that, do they? When you watch these Jane Austen movies, they don't show you the hiring fairs because it's always about the nicer side of life. And it doesn't mention as part of the culture about how they had the people tied to the properties, so they were fixed to having to work for you. So runaway mops, can you imagine? Do you think many serfs turned around and said, I don't want to work for you anymore, mister? No. So they do say that I suppose there's got to be some get-out clauses, and maybe they thought they were being fair to people by saying a runaway mop was a good idea. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that, or if you've ever seen the runaway mop being advertised. Apparently, Stratford-upon-Avon has their runaway mop on the 25th of October and the 26th of October. And they close the road to account for that. But I suspect that what is really happening is Google is just twisting the facts to suit the question, and no one can provide me with the information that has a poster that says runaway mop. So did runaway mops really exist? That's what I would like to know. There is a record of a mop fair taking place in Warwick in October 1928. The annual event happened especially in Warwick, Stratford-upon-Avon and some of the Warwickshire villages, and it also talks about 2 weeks after the first fair there would be the runaway mop. The title derived from the time of a hiring fair, and the reason for the second fair, as I've mentioned, was to allow the workers who didn't get on with their first employer to seek a new one, hence runaway. So you would hope they got lucky the second time. By the 1950s, the records suggest that there were no hiring workers taking place, so you didn't need to take a mop to any of these. And it was mainly about fun. It's quite sad in a way. So there's no central place if people are looking for a job for them to go, I know I can go there and essentially find work. Even the job centre doesn't have jobs available to people. It suggests that you go there and you might have a look and there might be jobs, but there aren't, are they? They're more intent on trying to not give you any money, from my perspective. That's my perception. I know it's not everybody's perception. So, does anybody have any stories about MOP fairs or hiring fairs? Have they read a book where they talked about hiring fairs and maybe talked about it from the perspective of the individual? I know Terry Pratchett talks about it when he talks about it happening in the new year, where people would get hired on New Year's Day and you would go off and you would get your apprenticeship, and that's you disappearing. And I don't think any negotiating in his books, he doesn't mention that. And because there's a book called Sorcery, and the guy in that definitely did not talk about negotiating wages at all. But they would come around and look at you and decide if you were fit for purpose. And you may recall in some older films that talk about slaves in Rome, where they would check your teeth and other parts depending on what they wanted to use you for. So they'd have slave fairs, wouldn't they? So there's always been a time where people have been waiting to gain new employment and a new owner. And when you look at the way that the statute of labourers was treating people, if you were stuck in one village working for one lord, then were you any different to being a slave? So thank you to those of you listening to Folklore Explorer. And if you've got any comments, do either comment below, or you can contact me at info@thedandelionmoon.co.uk. And I'd like to say thank you to the robin, who's given me some beautiful background noise today. Blessed be. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cauldron of Curiosities. If you enjoyed this dip into folklore, don't forget to follow the podcast, share it with a friend, and keep your lantern handy for the next curious tale.